The cobblestones of Florence echoed with the footsteps of destiny as young Niccolo Machiavelli walked through the bustling streets in 1485. At 16, he possessed sharp eyes that seemed to catch every political whisper, every secret glance between merchants, every subtle gesture of power that flowed through the Renaissance city like an invisible river. Florence in those days was a magnificent contradiction. Golden sunlight streamed through narrow alleyways where artists carved marble into angels, while in shadowy corners, conspirators plotted the downfall of princes. The Medici family had recently fallen from grace, their banking empire crumbling under political pressure and public uprising. Young Niccolo watched it all unfold with the curiosity of a scholar and the instincts of a predator. His father, Bernardo, was a lawyer of modest means who filled their home with books instead of gold. The Machiavelli family library became Niccolo's first classroom in the art of human nature. He devoured ancient texts by Livy and Tacitus, learning how Roman generals conquered empires and how politicians manipulated masses. But it was the living theater of Florence that provided his most valuable education. Every morning, Niccolo would position himself near the Palazzo della Signoria, watching as powerful men entered with confident strides and emerged with worried faces. He learned to read the language of power through body language, voice inflection, and the spaces between words. When Lorenzo de' Medici the Magnificent ruled, Niccolo observed how a single man could command respect through a combination of fear, admiration, and careful distribution of favors. The Pazzi conspiracy of 1478 had left deep scars on Florentine society. Niccolo heard the stories whispered in taverns about how Lorenzo's brother Giuliano was stabbed to death during Easter Mass, how Lorenzo himself barely escaped with his life, and how the failed assassination attempt actually strengthened Medici power rather than destroying it. These tales taught him a crucial lesson that would shape his entire philosophy. In politics, perception often matters more than reality. As he grew older, Niccolo began frequenting the workshops of artists and intellectuals who gathered around the city. He listened to Leonardo da Vinci discuss his engineering marvels, watched Michelangelo sketch human forms with divine precision, and engaged in heated debates with humanist philosophers about the nature of man and society. These conversations planted seeds of ideas that would later bloom into revolutionary political theory. But it was in the streets, markets, and government halls that Niccolo received his most practical education. He watched how successful merchants negotiated deals, how they built networks of loyalty, and how they survived when political winds shifted. He saw how some leaders inspired genuine devotion while others relied on fear, and he began to understand that effective governance required a delicate balance of both. The young man also witnessed the rise of Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar who preached against corruption and excess. Niccolo watched thousands of Florentines hang on Savonarola's every word, saw how the priest's passionate sermons could turn wealthy citizens into religious fanatics willing to burn their most precious possessions in bonfires of the vanities. This spectacle demonstrated the raw power of charisma and religious fervor, lessons that would later influence his understanding of how leaders could manipulate public opinion. When Savonarola himself was eventually arrested, tortured, and burned at the stake in 1498, Niccolo was among the crowds that witnessed his execution. The irony was not lost on him that the man who had preached against worldly power died because he had accumulated too much of it himself. This event crystallized his belief that idealism without practical political skill was a dangerous luxury that few could afford. During these formative years, Niccolo also traveled throughout central Italy, observing different forms of government and leadership. In Venice, he marveled at the Republic's sophisticated system of checks and balances. In Milan, he studied how the Sforza family maintained control through military might and strategic alliances. Each city-state provided a different model of governance, each with its own strengths and fatal weaknesses. His observations extended beyond politics to human psychology. Niccolo became fascinated by what motivated people to follow leaders, what caused them to rebel, and how individual ambitions could be channeled for collective benefit or destruction. He noticed how the same person could display nobility in one situation and treachery in another, depending on circumstances and incentives. These early experiences shaped his conviction that human nature was fundamentally predictable once you understood the underlying patterns of self-interest, fear, and ambition. He began to see politics not as a noble pursuit guided by moral principles, but as a practical science governed by natural laws as rigid as those that controlled the movement of planets. By his mid-20s, Niccolo had developed a reputation as a brilliant observer of human nature and political dynamics. His sharp wit, extensive reading, and practical understanding of power made him valuable to Florence's emerging republican government. Little did anyone know that this young man would soon be thrust into the highest levels of international diplomacy, where his theories about power and leadership would be tested in the most dangerous arenas of Renaissance politics. The stage was set for a career that would transform not just his own destiny, but humanity's understanding of political power itself. The great doors of the Palazzo Vecchio swung open on a crisp morning in 1498, and Niccolo Machiavelli stepped into his destiny. At 29, he had just been appointed second chancellor of the Florentine Republic, a position that would thrust him into the treacherous world of international diplomacy, where kings and princes played deadly games with entire nations as their pawns. His first major assignment came within months when Florence faced a crisis that would have broken lesser men. The city-state needed to reclaim rebellious territories, but lacked the military strength to do so by force alone. Niccolo was dispatched to negotiate with Jacopo di Piano, the Lord of Piombino, a man known for his cunning and ruthless ambition. This mission would become his first masterclass in the art of political manipulation. Arriving at Piombino's court with a small entourage, Niccolo quickly assessed his opponent. Di Piano was intelligent, suspicious, and surrounded by advisors who whispered poison in his ears. Rather than approaching with typical diplomatic pleasantries, Niccolo chose a different strategy. He presented himself as a fellow student of power, someone who understood the harsh realities of political survival. During their private meetings, Niccolo spoke frankly about the nature of alliances, the temporary value of treaties, and the importance of maintaining flexibility in an ever-changing political landscape. He flattered Di Piano's intelligence while subtly demonstrating Florence's potential as both a valuable ally and a dangerous enemy. The negotiations stretched for weeks, with each man probing the other's weaknesses and testing different approaches. The breakthrough came when Niccolo realized that Di Piano's greatest fear was not Florence's military might, but the possibility of being abandoned by his own supporters if his leadership appeared weak. Niccolo crafted a proposal that allowed Di Piano to appear strong to his followers while secretly providing Florence with the concessions they needed. The agreement was structured so that both sides could claim victory, a technique that would become one of Niccolo's signature diplomatic strategies. This success earned him recognition throughout Italy as a diplomatic talent worth watching. Soon, he was being sent on increasingly important missions to negotiate with some of the most powerful and dangerous figures of his era. Each assignment taught him new lessons about human nature and the mechanics of power. His encounter with Cesare Borgia in 1502 became perhaps the most influential experience of his diplomatic career. Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, was attempting to carve out his own kingdom in central Italy through a combination of military conquest, political alliances, and strategic betrayals. When Florence needed to negotiate safe passage for their merchants through Borgia's territories, they sent Niccolo as their representative. Meeting Cesare Borgia was like encountering a force of nature wrapped in human form. The man possessed an almost supernatural charisma, speaking with absolute confidence about his plans to unite Italy under his rule. But Niccolo quickly perceived that beneath the surface charm lay a calculating intelligence that viewed other human beings as tools to be used and discarded according to strategic necessity. During their negotiations, Borgia demonstrated lessons in statecraft that Niccolo would never forget. When local lords in the Romagna region plotted against him, Borgia pretended to reconcile with them, invited them to a peaceful meeting, and then had them all arrested and executed in a single night. The brutal efficiency of this action impressed Niccolo, not because he admired the violence, but because he recognized the strategic brilliance of neutralizing multiple threats simultaneously while sending a clear message to other potential enemies. Niccolo spent weeks observing Borgia's methods firsthand. He watched how the Duke balanced cruelty with generosity, how he used fear and reward to maintain loyalty among his followers, and how he carefully managed his public image to inspire both respect and terror. These observations would later form the foundation of his most famous political theories. But Niccolo also recognized Borgia's fatal flaw, his ultimate dependence on his father's papal power. When Pope Alexander VI died unexpectedly in 1503, Borgia's empire began crumbling almost immediately. Niccolo witnessed this collapse with fascination, understanding that even the most brilliant political strategies could be undone by circumstances beyond one's control. His missions to France proved equally educational, though in different ways. King Louis XII represented a different model of leadership, ruling through established institutions and traditional authority rather than personal charisma and military force. Niccolo studied how the French monarchy had created systems of governance that could survive weak individual rulers, providing stability that Italian city-states often lacked. During his time at the French court, Niccolo also observed how different cultural values shaped political behavior. The French nobility operated according to codes of honor and feudal obligation that were foreign to Italian politics. This exposure to alternative systems of power taught him that successful governance required understanding and adapting to local customs and expectations. His diplomatic career reached its peak during the mission to Emperor Maximilian I in 1507. The Holy Roman Emperor was attempting to assert control over northern Italy, and Florence needed to navigate this threat without triggering a military confrontation they could not win. Niccolo's task was to delay, deflect, and diplomatically outmaneuver one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. The negotiations required all of his accumulated skills in reading human psychology and political dynamics. Maximilian was proud, impulsive, and easily flattered, but also surrounded by advisors with their own agendas. Niccolo crafted a strategy that played to the emperor's vanity while creating procedural delays that gave Florence time to strengthen their position through other alliances. Throughout these diplomatic missions, Niccolo was simultaneously developing his theories about effective leadership and statecraft. He began writing detailed reports not just about immediate diplomatic outcomes, but about the underlying principles he observed governing political success and failure. His dispatches back to Florence became masterpieces of political analysis, demonstrating insights that went far beyond simple negotiations. The experience of representing a relatively weak republic in negotiations with powerful monarchs taught him valuable lessons about the relationship between military strength and diplomatic effectiveness. He saw how Florence's lack of reliable military forces limited their options and made them vulnerable to threats from stronger neighbors. This realization led him to become an advocate for military reform within Florence. He argued passionately for the creation of citizen militias that would give the Republic greater independence and security. His proposals were initially met with skepticism, but his diplomatic successes had earned him enough credibility to push for experimental programs. By 1512, Niccolo had established himself as one of the most skilled diplomatic minds in Italy. His network of contacts extended throughout Europe, and his reputation for brilliant political analysis was known in courts from Paris to Rome. He had negotiated with kings, emperors, popes, and princes, learning something valuable from each encounter. But even as he reached the height of his influence, political storm clouds were gathering that would soon transform his life completely. The Medici family was preparing to return to Florence, backed by papal and Spanish military power. The Republican government that had provided Niccolo with his platform for diplomatic brilliance was about to fall, and with it would come the end of his official career and the beginning of his transformation from practitioner to theorist of political power. The morning of September 1, 1512, dawned gray and ominous over Florence as Spanish troops marched through the city gates, their armor gleaming despite the overcast sky. Niccolo Machiavelli stood at his office window in the Palazzo Vecchio, watching his world collapse with the methodical precision of a military campaign. The Florentine Republic, which had been his life's work and source of power for 14 years, was breathing its last breaths. Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, soon to become Pope Leo X, had orchestrated the Republic's downfall with masterful political maneuvering. The same family that Niccolo had watched rise and fall in his youth had returned with foreign backing and papal authority to reclaim their ancestral control over Florence. For a man who had spent his career studying the mechanics of power, the irony was not lost on him that he was now experiencing firsthand how quickly political fortunes could reverse. Within days of the Medici restoration, Niccolo received the news he had been dreading. His dismissal from office came with cold administrative efficiency. 14 years of diplomatic brilliance, countless successful negotiations, and an unparalleled understanding of European politics counted for nothing in the face of changing political winds. He was not just losing his job, He was losing his identity, his purpose, and his access to the corridors of power that had defined his existence. The dismissal was accompanied by an order that cut even deeper. He was banned from entering the Palazzo Vecchio and forbidden from traveling outside Florentine territory for 1 year. The man who had negotiated with kings and emperors, who had been trusted with the Republic's most sensitive diplomatic missions, was now treated as a potential security threat. The psychological impact was devastating, but Niccolò's analytical mind immediately began studying his own downfall as a case study in political vulnerability. His financial situation became precarious almost immediately. The generous salary that had supported his comfortable lifestyle vanished, leaving him dependent on income from his small family farm in Sant'Andrea in Percussina, outside Florence. This property, inherited from his father, became both his refuge and his prison. The man who had once dined with royalty now found himself supervising olive harvests and arguing with peasants about crop yields. But the worst was yet to come. In February 1513, a conspiracy against the Medici was discovered, and Niccolò's name appeared on a list found in one of the conspirators' possessions. The evidence was circumstantial at best, but in the paranoid atmosphere following a regime change, even the appearance of sedition was enough to warrant arrest. The experience of imprisonment and torture became a defining moment in Niccolò's life. Confined in the basement cells of the Bargello prison, he endured interrogation sessions designed to extract confessions through physical and psychological pressure. The torture device known as the strappedo was employed, lifting him by his arms bound behind his back, causing excruciating pain without leaving permanent damage that would invalidate any confession obtained. Throughout this ordeal, Niccolò's intellectual curiosity remained remarkably intact. Even while suffering, he observed the psychology of his interrogators, noting how they alternated between threats and false sympathy to break down resistance. He studied his fellow prisoners, learning how different personalities responded to confinement and pressure. These observations would later inform his understanding of how fear and intimidation function as tools of political control. His letters from prison reveal a man determined to maintain his dignity and intellectual independence despite physical suffering. He wrote to friends with dark humor about his situation, describing his accommodations with ironic wit while subtly asserting his innocence. These letters also served a strategic purpose, keeping his name and plight in the minds of influential contacts who might assist him. The election of Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici as Pope Leo X in March 1513 provided an unexpected opportunity for freedom. The new pope declared a general amnesty to celebrate his elevation, and Niccolò was among those released. However, his freedom came with conditions that ensured his continued marginalization from political life. Returning to his farm in Sant'Andrea, Niccolò faced the challenge of reinventing himself. At 44, he was too young to accept retirement, but too politically tainted to return to government service. The intellectual energy that had once been channeled into diplomatic negotiations and administrative duties now needed a new outlet. His daily routine at the farm became a carefully structured attempt to maintain his connection to the world of ideas and political analysis. Mornings were spent on practical matters, supervising agricultural work and dealing with the mundane realities of rural life. But evenings were reserved for intellectual pursuits that kept his mind sharp and his political insights current. The tavern in nearby San Cassiano became his informal office, where he gathered with local residents to discuss everything from crop prices to international politics. These conversations might have seemed like idle chatter to casual observers, but Niccolò used them as opportunities to test his theories about human nature against the behavior of ordinary people. He discovered that the same principles that governed the actions of princes also applied to farmers and merchants, though on a smaller scale. His correspondence during this period reveals a man struggling to maintain relevance while physically isolated from centers of power. He wrote letters to Francesco Vettori, his friend who held a diplomatic position in Rome, seeking information about political developments and offering his own analysis of current events. These letters became exercises in applied political theory, demonstrating his continued value as a strategic thinker. The psychological impact of his fall from grace was profound. Niccolò experienced periods of deep depression, feeling that his talents were being wasted while inferior minds guided policy decisions. He worried about his legacy, fearing that his diplomatic achievements would be forgotten and his insights into statecraft would die with him. But this period of isolation also sparked his greatest creative phase. Cut off from the immediate pressures of diplomatic life, he had the intellectual space to synthesize years of observations into systematic theories. The practical experiences of his diplomatic career provided raw material, while his forced retirement gave him time to transform those experiences into lasting wisdom. He began work on several writing projects simultaneously, each exploring different aspects of political power and human nature. His comedy, The Mandrake, satirized the moral corruption of contemporary society while demonstrating his understanding of human psychology. His discourses on Livy examined the lessons that Renaissance politics could learn from ancient Roman history. But it was during the long, quiet evenings at his farm that the ideas for his masterpiece began to crystallize. The work that would eventually become The Prince emerged from his desperate desire to demonstrate his continued value to the Medici rulers and his deep need to distill everything he had learned about political power into a practical handbook for leaders. His exile had taught him lessons that success never could. He now understood vulnerability from personal experience, knew how quickly fortune could turn, and had felt the helplessness of being subject to the whims of those in power. These insights, combined with his years of diplomatic experience, created a unique perspective that would revolutionize political thought. The man who had once been trusted with state secrets and diplomatic missions was now viewed with suspicion by the very people he hoped to serve. But this enforced distance from power also provided him with the objectivity needed to analyze political dynamics without the bias that comes from being personally invested in specific outcomes. As 1513 drew to a close, Niccolo began writing the work that would make him immortal. He had no way of knowing that his greatest contribution to humanity would emerge not from his diplomatic triumphs, but from his profound understanding of political failure and personal vulnerability. The prince he would create on paper would be more lasting than any of the real princes he had served. The candlelight flickered across the pages as Niccolo Machiavelli dipped his quill into ink for what felt like the 1000th time that evening. Outside his modest farmhouse window, the Tuscan countryside lay silent under a canopy of stars. But inside, a revolution in political thinking was taking shape word by carefully chosen word. It was late 1513, and the former diplomat was about to create a work that would forever change how humanity understood power, leadership, and the darker truths of political survival. Each evening after completing his farm duties, Niccolo performed a ritual that transformed him from a rural exile into one of history's most penetrating political minds. He would remove his muddy work clothes, wash carefully, and dress in his finest garments as if preparing for an audience with royalty. In his own words, he was entering the ancient courts of ancient men, where he could converse with the greatest thinkers and leaders of the past. The work he was creating emerged from a unique fusion of classical learning and brutal contemporary experience. On his desk lay volumes by ancient historians like Livy and Tacitus, their pages worn from countless readings. But the real laboratory for his theories was his memory, filled with vivid recollections of his encounters with the most powerful and dangerous figures of his era. As he wrote about effective leadership, Niccolo's mind returned repeatedly to Cesare Borgia, the ruthless duke who had demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of political ambition. He crafted passages describing how Borgia had eliminated his enemies through a combination of deception and decisive action, presenting these methods not as moral exemplars, but as practical necessities for anyone seeking to acquire and maintain power. The revolutionary aspect of Niccolo's approach was his systematic separation of effective governance from traditional moral constraints. Previous political treatises had focused on how rulers should behave according to Christian virtue or classical ideals of honor. Niccolo was writing about how rulers actually behaved when their survival was threatened, and what methods proved most effective in the harsh realities of political competition. His analysis of fortune versus skill became one of the most influential concepts in the emerging work. Drawing from his observations of leaders who had succeeded and failed, he argued that while chance played a significant role in political outcomes, skilled leaders could influence their destiny through careful preparation and bold action when opportunities arose. He compared fortune to a violent river that could be channeled through proper engineering, but would be destructive if left unchecked. The section on whether it was better to be loved or feared emerged from his direct experiences with different leadership styles. He had seen leaders who relied primarily on affection from their subjects, and observed how quickly that affection could turn to contempt when the leader appeared weak. Conversely, he had witnessed the effectiveness of rulers who maintained control through carefully calibrated intimidation, ensuring that fear never escalated into desperation that might provoke rebellion. Writing about the importance of maintaining appearances while being flexible about methods, Niccolo drew from countless diplomatic negotiations where he had seen successful leaders project one image publicly while pursuing entirely different strategies privately. He argued that effective rulers must master the art of seeming virtuous while being prepared to act with calculated ruthlessness when circumstances demanded it. His treatment of religion as a political tool rather than a moral guide reflected his observations of how various leaders had used religious authority to legitimize their power. He had watched Pope Alexander VI weaponize papal authority to advance his son Caesar's military campaigns, and had seen how Savonarola's religious fervor had initially strengthened his political position before ultimately contributing to his destruction. The work's most shocking passages dealt with the strategic use of cruelty and deception. Niccolo argued that rulers who failed to use these tools when necessary were actually being cruel to their subjects, because their weakness would eventually lead to greater suffering through political instability or foreign conquest. This reasoning represented a fundamental challenge to conventional morality, suggesting that what appeared virtuous could actually be harmful, while seemingly vicious actions might serve the greater good. As he developed these themes, Niccolo was acutely aware that he was writing something unprecedented and potentially dangerous. Political treatises traditionally offered idealistic visions of perfect governance or historical chronicles of past events. He was creating a practical manual for political survival that acknowledged and even embraced the darker aspects of human nature and political reality. The psychological portraits he crafted of different personality types reflected his deep understanding of human motivation. He described how to manage ambitious subordinates who might become threats, how to identify and neutralize potential conspiracies, and how to balance the competing demands of different social classes. Each recommendation was grounded in specific historical examples and personal observations from his diplomatic career. His analysis of military affairs drew from his frustrating experiences trying to reform Florence's defense capabilities. He argued passionately that rulers who depended on mercenary forces or foreign allies for protection were fundamentally vulnerable, because these external supporters would abandon them the moment it became advantageous to do so. Only rulers with their own loyal military forces could maintain true independence and security. The work's structure reflected Niccolo's systematic approach to political analysis. He began with fundamental principles about human nature and political necessity, then moved through specific techniques for acquiring power, maintaining control, and managing various challenges that rulers typically faced. Each chapter built upon previous concepts while introducing new complexities and practical applications. Throughout the writing process, Niccolo was driven by multiple motivations that sometimes conflicted with each other. He genuinely wanted to provide useful guidance for effective governance, believing that skilled leadership could bring stability and prosperity to Italian territories that had suffered from decades of warfare and political chaos. Simultaneously, he hoped that demonstrating his analytical abilities might lead to his rehabilitation and return to political service under the Medici regime. His personal frustration with idealistic political theories that failed in practice permeated every page. He had witnessed too many well-intentioned leaders destroyed by their own naive adherence to conventional moral principles. His work was intended as an antidote to this dangerous idealism, offering instead a clear-eyed assessment of what actually worked in the brutal arena of political competition. The writing process itself became a form of therapy for his sense of political exile and irrelevance. By analyzing and systematizing his observations, he was proving to himself, and potentially to others, that his years of diplomatic experience had produced insights of lasting value. The work became both a demonstration of his continued intellectual vitality and a bid for renewed political relevance. As winter deepened and the manuscript grew, Niccolo began to sense that he was creating something extraordinary. The combination of classical learning, contemporary observation, and unflinching realism was producing a political analysis unlike anything that had been written before. He was not just describing political techniques. He was revealing the fundamental principles that governed all political behavior, whether in ancient Rome or Renaissance Italy. The final chapters synthesized his observations into a coherent philosophy of leadership that acknowledged both the potential nobility and the inescapable brutality of political power. He argued that truly effective leaders must be capable of both inspiring devotion and inspiring fear, of both keeping faith and breaking promises, of both appearing virtuous and acting with calculated vice. By early 1514, the work was essentially complete, though Niccolo would continue refining and revising it for years to come. He had created a masterpiece of political analysis that would scandalize some readers while providing practical wisdom for others. More importantly, he had transformed his personal experience of political failure into a lasting contribution to human understanding of power and leadership. The summer of 1527 brought chaos to Florence once again, and with it, an unexpected final opportunity for Niccolò Machiavelli to return to the political arena that had defined his life. Imperial troops had sacked Rome, the Medici Pope Clement VII was in hiding, and the Florentine Republic had been restored for the second time in Niccolo's lifetime. At 58, the aging political theorist found himself eligible for government service once more, though the world he returned to was vastly different from the one he had left 15 years earlier. The Republican leaders who controlled Florence in 1527 were familiar with Niccolo's reputation as both a brilliant analyst and a former servant of their previous iteration. However, they were also aware of his attempts to curry favor with the Medici during his years of exile. This created a delicate situation where his expertise was valued, but his loyalty remained suspect. When offered a relatively minor administrative position, Niccolò accepted with enthusiasm that masked his disappointment at not being restored to his former prominence. His return to political life revealed how much both he and the world had changed during his exile. The naive optimism that had characterized his earlier career had been replaced by a more realistic understanding of political limitations and human frailty. He now approached diplomatic challenges with the same analytical detachment he had brought to writing The Prince, viewing political developments as case studies in the theories he had developed rather than as personal tests of his abilities. The irony of his situation was not lost on him. Here he was, the man who had written the definitive guide to political power, serving in a minor capacity while lesser minds made crucial decisions about Florence's future. His colleagues would often seek his advice on complex political matters, recognizing his analytical brilliance, but they remained reluctant to trust him with significant authority. This dynamic perfectly illustrated one of his own theories about the relationship between reputation and practical influence. During these final months of active service, Niccolò worked on several projects that reflected his mature understanding of political reality. He drafted proposals for military reform that drew directly from arguments he had made in The Prince about the necessity of citizen armies. He also wrote analytical reports about the changing balance of power in Italy, demonstrating that his insights remained sharp despite his advanced age. But even as he attempted to contribute to Florence's governance, his health was deteriorating rapidly. Years of financial stress, political disappointment, and intense intellectual labor had taken their toll on his constitution. He suffered from stomach ailments that grew progressively worse, and friends noted that his legendary energy was finally beginning to flag. The symptoms that would ultimately kill him began manifesting in early June 1527. What started as digestive problems evolved into severe abdominal pain that left him unable to concentrate on his work or maintain his usually vigorous correspondence. Medical knowledge of the era was primitive, and the treatments available provided little relief for what was probably a serious gastrointestinal condition, possibly complications from an ulcer or internal infection. As his condition worsened, Niccolò found himself confronting the ultimate test of his own philosophical principles. Throughout his career, he had argued that skilled individuals could influence their fate through careful planning and decisive action. Now he faced a challenge that no amount of political cunning could overcome. The man who had advised princes on how to conquer fortune was being defeated by his own mortal limitations. His final weeks were spent in his modest home in Florence, surrounded by family members and close friends who had remained loyal throughout his political ups and downs. Despite his physical suffering, his intellectual curiosity remained intact until nearly the end. Visitors reported conversations where he analyzed current political developments with the same penetrating insight that had made him famous, even while clearly struggling with pain and weakness. The end came on June 21, 1527, after several days of intense suffering that medical intervention could not alleviate. Those present described a death that was both peaceful and somehow fitting for a man who had spent his life studying the unpredictable nature of human fortune. He died as he had lived in his later years, with dignity intact, but without the worldly success that his talents seemingly deserved. His funeral was a modest affair that reflected both his reduced circumstances and the political uncertainties of the times. The same Florentine elite who had valued his counsel but distrusted his loyalty attended the ceremony, offering formal tributes to his intellectual achievements while carefully avoiding any suggestion that his political methods should be emulated. He was buried in the Church of Santa Croce, in a simple tomb that gave little indication of the revolutionary ideas contained in the mind it housed. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Niccolo's reputation remained complex and controversial. The prince had circulated in manuscript form among political insiders for more than a decade, earning both admiration for its analytical brilliance and condemnation for its apparent endorsement of political ruthlessness. Many readers understood that he was describing rather than advocating for the methods he analyzed, but others interpreted his work as a manual for tyranny. The first printed edition of The Prince appeared in 1532, 5 years after his death, and immediately sparked debates that continue to this day. Religious authorities condemned it as a handbook for atheistic materialism, while political practitioners secretly studied it for practical insights. The work's influence spread rapidly throughout Europe, translated into multiple languages and read by rulers, advisors, and intellectuals who recognized its unique value. Over the centuries that followed, Niccolo's reputation underwent multiple transformations that reflected changing political circumstances and intellectual fashions. During periods when strong, centralized authority was valued, his insights were praised as realistic and necessary. During eras that emphasized moral idealism in politics, his work was denounced as cynical and dangerous. Each generation of readers discovered different aspects of his thought that seemed relevant to their contemporary challenges. The ultimate irony of his legacy is how completely it contradicted his own theories about the relationship between virtue and worldly success. Despite possessing exactly the kind of analytical intelligence and practical wisdom that he argued should lead to political triumph, Niccolo himself never achieved the lasting power and influence he sought during his lifetime. His greatest impact came not from his diplomatic negotiations or administrative reforms, but from his systematic analysis of why such efforts so often failed. Modern political science, international relations theory, and strategic studies all trace significant portions of their intellectual foundations to insights first articulated in Niccolo's writings. His influence extends far beyond academic circles to shape how contemporary leaders, business executives, and military strategists think about power, competition, and survival in hostile environments. Perhaps most remarkably, his work provided a vocabulary and analytical framework for understanding political behavior that remains relevant across cultural and historical boundaries. The concepts he developed while analyzing Renaissance Italian politics have proven applicable to democratic governance, authoritarian regimes, corporate competition, and international diplomacy. His core insights about human nature and institutional dynamics transcend the specific historical circumstances that inspired them. The man who vanished from political prominence during his lifetime achieved a form of immortality through ideas that continue to influence how humanity understands power and leadership. His systematic separation of effective governance from conventional morality established intellectual foundations for modern political realism, while his emphasis on practical wisdom over idealistic theory continues to guide strategic thinking across multiple disciplines. In death, Niccolo Machiavelli became the phantom he had never quite managed to be in life, his influence operating invisibly but powerfully through generations of readers who absorbed his insights and applied them to challenges he could never have imagined. The ultimate validation of his theories came not from any individual political triumph, but from their enduring ability to illuminate the permanent patterns underlying human political behavior.